Hey everyone, welcome. Thanks for being here. We've got a little introduction, some things that we're going to go over, but we're going to try and move things along quickly. Everyone's excited to hear from Dominic, we know. So just a few introductory things here as other folks are dropping in. I just wanted to welcome everyone. My name is Alex. I'm with the Pacific Northwest Forest Climate Alliance, he and him pronouns, and I'm speaking to you all from occupied Multnomah and Clackamas Chinookan lands, also known as Portland. I just wanted to introduce the webinar today. As I think we all know, with only a fraction of mature and old growth forests remaining intact across the United States, identifying where those stands are is vital for efforts to protect drinking water, biodiversity, and our climate. Until Dr. DellaSala's new research, there hasn't been a comprehensive mapping and inventory of mature and old growth forests across the continental US. And in the context of President Biden's recent executive orders regarding inventorying mature and old growth forests and natural climate solutions, Dominic's research is groundbreaking and ahead of the curve and pointing the way towards greater protections for these lands and ecosystems. So Dominic's going to go over a lot of information, including providing a detailed summary of the carbon, biodiversity, and drinking water benefits of the nation's nearly 400 million acres of mature and old growth forests, as well as estimates for carbon that would be fluxed to the atmosphere if over 50 million acres of unprotected mature forests on federal lands were logged. This work is part of an international team of scientists, including IPCC scientists, that are mapping and assessing biodiversity and climate importance of the world's dwindling primary and old growth forests. There's a lot that could be said about Dominic and all the amazing work that he's done, but Dr. Dominic DellaSala is the chief scientist at Wild Heritage and also the former president of the Society for Conservation Biology in North America. He's an internationally renowned author of over 200 scientific papers on forest and fire ecology, conservation biology, endangered species management, and landscape ecology. Dominic has given plenary and keynote talks ranging from academic conferences to the United Nations Earth Summit, and has served on numerous committees, including White House Council task forces on forests and on Oregon's Global Warming Commission Carbon Task Force reporting to the governor. I'll just mention real briefly that there's also an open comment period with the federal government in regards to President Biden's Earth Day executive order about mapping and inventorying mature and old growth forests on federal lands. We're going to bring that up again later and provide some information for how folks can plug in and submit comments to that. But in the meantime, I'm going to pass it over to you, Paula, to do some housekeeping for us.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Paula with Blue Mountains Biodiversity Project, she, her pronouns, and I'm joining from Eugene, which is part of traditional Kalapuya lands. And I just wanted to take a brief moment to go over some housekeeping and webinar logistics. And so there will be time for Q&A and discussion after the presentation. If you have any questions for Dr. DellaSala, you can enter them into the Q&A, which is on the icon at the bottom of your screen, and the moderators will select and read the questions at the end of the presentation. Note also that everyone besides the presenter and our moderators are automatically muted and will remain so throughout the webinar. If the moderators need to communicate with the audience, we'll be using the chat function, so please keep an eye on that. And I also want to thank our sponsors and co-sponsors. So huge thanks to John Muir Project for sponsoring the webinar and hosting it on their platform. And also big thanks to sponsors, the Pacific Northwest Forest Climate Alliance, the Forest Carbon Coalition, Climate Forest Campaign, and Blue Mountains Biodiversity Project. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. DellaSala to start his presentation.
Well, hi, everybody, and thank you for joining. It's exciting to see so many people that are coming into the Zoom chat, and really appreciate your time today. Some pretty exciting materials that we'll be bringing forward to you in this presentation. And because I had a big Mac attack this morning, my computer kept crashing on my PowerPoint. So as we go through this, I'm going to ask Jennifer, when ready, to start advancing the slides. But I just wanted to kind of point out a couple of preface remarks. I have this amazing team of scientists that I work with that are global in scope, including scientists from the International Panel on Climate Change. scientists from Woodwell Climate Research Center, and scientists from Griffith University in Australia, which I just got back from. We have been collectively managing, or mapping rather, the world's dwindling primary forest. And I was given North America as a case study. And some of that work has been funded by One Earth and many other funders that I didn't squeeze the logos on this slide, but I at least wanted to recognize the scientific input that's going into this project. It's just amazing how many people have been involved in this, that you're going to be seeing kind of a fire hose of information that we're trying to boil down. I also need to preface that everything you're going to see today is still in peer review, with the exception of the Tongass, which was published in March. So that analysis for old growth forest attributes is already out there in the literature. The material you're seeing today, there's 2 manuscripts that are currently going through the peer review process at this time. So kind of keep that in mind, that things are going to change as it goes through peer review, but you're getting a nice snapshot of where we're headed with this. And I've just had this dream for at least a decade. Damn, why can't we do a map, a mature and old growth forest in the United States? What the heck? How can we be in the most data rich country in the world and we don't have a map of these forests? And then along came NASA. And in 2019, they released all their LiDAR data from the space platform, and it took a while to get it processed. We didn't do the processing, other researchers did. And we're benefiting from that. And we're benefiting from the forest inventory analysis work of the Forest Service, the FIA plot data that you'll see today as well. So I need to kind of acknowledge that this is an amazing accomplishment with new information that is only now just available to the public. And it's now allowed us to do what was on my bucket list, to give us a snapshot of mature and old growth forests around the country. And that's what you're going to see today. So next slide, please. And yeah, call out to the sponsors. Standing Trees was also involved as a sponsor of putting together the call for participants at this workshop today. I'm only responsible for the material in here, but the groups were heavily involved in getting the word out so that we could get so many participants today. And the timing is perfect because we have a comment period, as mentioned, that the agencies are doing on inventory and threat assessment of mature and old growth forests, which, by the way, was just extended today another 15 days. We can talk about that at the end. It's now going out to the end of the month, so you have time to submit comments even further. Next slide. So it was really fascinating that President Biden on Earth Day called for us the lungs of the planet. And a number of us have been saying this for some time. The forests are the lungs of the planet. The Amazon gets a lot of credit for that, rightfully so. But when you look at North America's lungs, they're the mature and old growth forest, and they're metastasizing, mostly from logging, as we'll find out later on in the presentation. But we've had these series of pledges that have led up to executive orders and statements and pledges being made at the, it started at the New York Declaration in 2014, and the United States was a non-binding signatory on that end deforestation pledge. And then the last climate summit last year, the president also renewed the pledge and said, hey, we got to end deforestation and degradation by 2030. And the focus, the aim at that point was on the Amazon, which is really the climate center of the world and so important, but the boreal and the temperate regions are important too. And so we got this first executive order that came shortly after Biden took office that, looks at 30% of lands and waters protected by 2030, 30 by 30 as it's commonly called. And we'll talk about that in a minute. That was followed by an executive order on Earth Day that said, go out there, federal agencies, and inventory mature and old growth forests, give me some definitions, and do a threat assessment. But curiously, in the announcement, there was no mention of logging. And as you'll see today, that is the principal threat of the decline of mature and old growth forests across the United States. Meanwhile, despite all these pledges and executive orders, climate change is speeding up. You can see the classic figure there of atmospheric CO2. I mean, we're at 420 parts per million. And the further away from that safety net of 350 we get, the more severe the impacts. You can see them playing out all over the world right now. It's getting dire. And at the same time, we're having the equivalent of about 18 soccer fields being deforested every minute of the day around the globe. Most of that's in the tropics, but not all of it. And when you look at the emissions, and this is some data from the World Wildlife Fund, global emissions from degradation and deforestation amount to 20% of the total, which is more than the entire global transportation network. Yet this is not getting the kind of recognition that rightfully getting off of fossil fuels is getting. We're not even close to having any progress on this on a global scale, and we need to, because natural climate solutions need to complement getting off of fossil fuels. Next slide, please. So this is the famous or infamous Greeley map, and Greeley was a Forest Service chief that in 1925 produced these maps of what he was calling at the time primary or virgin forest. Actually, virgin forest was the concept. And now keep in mind, Native people were living in these forests, so and living sustainably. And you look at where we were estimated back in the 1600s, and where the 1850 map goes and where the 1926 map goes. So going fast is the notion here with primary forest. And in the context of the United States, most of the primary forests that we're looking at there were old growth. Not all of them, because those forests are going to burn, they're going to get eaten by insects, and they're still important. They're still primary if they don't have industrial activity in them, which is what the definition is. Primary forests are those forests that have not had industrial activity, and they could have Native people living in them as well. So we're running out. The clock is ticking on those forests. Old growth is in this special case of primary, but it could be any age class. Next slide. I think you skipped one, so please go back one. There, no. Must be gone. Must have been in the collapse this morning. So anyway, we get this tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad, January 2021 executive order, and the notion of conserving at least 30%, but it doesn't talk about what conserve means. And I know the folks at the White House are trying to figure this out. What counts? Is it gap 1 and 2, which is strict level of protection? You'll hear about that later on. Do roadless areas count? Because you can do stuff in roadless areas. What about working lands? And some conservation measures on that. So the administration is looking at how they do the tally. And as you learned from my talk, what only counts in the scientific community is gap 1 and gap 2, strict levels of protection, like what you get in wilderness, national monuments, some wildlife refuges, and so forth. So you've got to have that level of protection to count in scientific circles. So that's what America the Beautiful is currently looking at, but it really doesn't have any statements on land protections for especially public lands. And 2030 is 8 years from now. And yet we are approaching a tipping point on many different levels, atmospherically, on the loss of biodiversity on a global scale. We really don't have another 8 to 10 years. We've got to do this now. We're running out of time. Every climate change scientist that I talk to, and they won't say this in public, but they're concerned that time is running out and we may have already crossed that threshold. And unless we do something drastic and major soon, an Apollo shot in terms of policies, we're going to see increasingly severe climate extremes. Next slide. And then we had the executive order on Earth Day. Yay, lungs, the forest are the lungs of the planet. And if you look at what I've highlighted here, the things that they're talking about have nothing to do with logging. It's all about wildfire risk, insect damage, climate change, resilience, wildfire risk reduction. And then they mentioned the first ever inventory. Yeah, that's okay. We could work together on this, even though we got 2 papers in review. Let's work together on it, and we can announce it together as the first ever inventory of mature and old growth on federal lands. Now, they set out to do this in a year, and it's my hope that, as we go through the peer review process, we could just hand this over and say, here's all the shape files, here's all our data analysis using the definitions that we've used that you'll see in a minute. We got a jump start on it. So how can we work together? How can we help you figure this out, you being federal agencies? Next slide. And then we had a secretarial memo from Secretary Tom Vilsack to the Forest Service talking about bold action. Again, I've highlighted all this stuff in there. None of it identifies logging. It's, catastrophic wildfires are threatening these forests. And, if you read further, it's insect damage. It's, let's build resilience to those natural disturbances. And they mentioned climate smart forestry, but, anytime you pull trees out of a forest, it's not climate smart because most of that carbon goes into the atmosphere. So even that term climate smart, it needs to be carefully defined because in reality, the atmosphere sees it as carbon. So how is that smart? And so also it mentions conserving, but it doesn't talk about what conserving means or what protecting from what means. And those are things that really we're hoping to fine tune with our comments going forward. Next slide. So in the meantime, are we really just fiddling while Rome is literally burning? And here's what's happened over the past couple of years. And more recently, this year, we're seeing unprecedented fires and heat-related deaths in Europe, places that are burning in ways that haven't burned before. And many people in Europe don't have air conditioning. So we're seeing heat-related deaths now in many places. We've got mega droughts in Western United States that are driving a lot of these big fires, and floods in Kentucky and Yellowstone. People are dying over this. And in the meantime, you've got the Inflation Reduction Act that has fossil fuel subsidies in it and subsidies for biomass burning, which I have no idea how they're going to claim that if that goes into law, how they're going to reduce emissions by 40%. It just doesn't seem like they've done the numbers properly when they're looking at all these federal subsidies, particularly for biomass burning. We've got the Russian war that's driving the demand for oil and gas, including in the United States. It's coming at a really bad time. We had the SCOTUS decision, the Supreme Court decision that limits EPA's power to curb emissions. And then we've got the infrastructure law that's scaling up fuel reduction, that's putting more emissions into the atmosphere, that's going to trigger fires down the line. So we're heading in the wrong direction. And in the meantime, Elon Musk dishes out the first $100 million prize for carbon capture. And a number of us wanted to send them the picture on the right. That's the best carbon capture we have right now terrestrially. Mature old growth forests are the best at carbon accumulation. They deserve the $100 million prize, as you'll see as we go forward. Next slide. All right, so this is what's on everybody's mind right now. I think we could pretty much get to quick agreement on what old growth is. These are the cathedral forests. We know it when we're in it. And, they just pop out. They're eye-popping. They're amazing. And, for the past 30 years of my career, I've been going around the planet documenting their biodiversity and bioblitzes. And so we've done a good job of figuring out what that age class means and why it's important from a biodiversity standpoint. It's only been the last 10 years or so that we've really started nailing down the climate angle, particularly the carbon that is being stored in these forests. So in terms of mature, though, there are many different ways you can look at this, but we think a good way to look at it is it's the result of advancing structure, process, and function in these forests. We know what this is right now. It's not rocket science. It should not take a year. We can get to this right now. We know what those features are of mature forests, and I'm going to go through them quickly. So every forester is familiar with the concept of the culmination of mean annual increment. And that's a point at which the trees, the growth in trees slows down. So they're mature. They're ready to be logged or harvested. So just flip that around. and say that's when they're mature, that's your cutoff. And it's the age of biological maturation. And it varies, but generally 60 to 80 years is a good starting point. And it varies again across sites and across forest types, but you can look at the cumulative mean annual increment and nail it that way. Or just set it at 80 and say, this is a good standard that we're going to work from, as you'll find out why that's important in a minute. And it's mainly because you get structure that starts to come in when those forests are about 80. You've got large trees, you've got vertical and horizontal layering in the forest, you've got a lot of snags and down logs, you've got canopy complex branching. I mean, all of this starts to show up at 80. Is it old growth? No. But we don't have much old growth left. There's only about 5% left, as you saw in the original slide from Greeley in the continental United States. So we got to start somewhere. Let's peg it at mature so we can get the old growth back. And at that point, you start to get rich soil horizons. You get incredibly deeply connected mycorrhizae connections. It's kind of this underground highway of plant nutrient and chemical and water exchange between plants. They're all kind of connected in an avatar way. Beneath the surface that we don't even fully understand yet, but it's really complicated and complex when they're about 80 years old. The gap phase dynamics kick in, the predator-prey food webs are present, pollination is present, nutrient cycling is going, and it's starting to develop old growth characteristics. And the functions are you're getting climate buffering, particularly if you're surrounded by clear cuts. Those mature forests are going to be cooler, are going to be moister. You get better water regulation, you get more ecosystem services as these forests get to the mature stage. And so we're saying, 80 or so is a reasonable target for a national standard. And the Northwest Forest Plan is a good example of how 80 became the standard there. So 80 is a good point to really start looking for these characteristics. And you got this information on the FIA plots. Every forester knows how to core a tree to get an age. This is done in timber stand exams. So we're saying 80 is a good start. So next slide. So why is 80 important? A lot of it has to do with photosynthesis and the carbon capture of plants and the ability to store and accumulate carbon. It's not just sequestration, but it's the annual rate of accumulation. And those big trees are a big stick of carbon that's been accumulating annually for centuries. And you don't want that going back up into the atmosphere. And they're also releasing water slowly to the surroundings and back up into the atmosphere. There's a connection between the biosphere and the hydrosphere. It's all connected. And we're seeing it in most advanced stages in these older forests. Next slide. And so this is really important. This slide, this rate of accumulation, this figure on the right is that as the tree size increases, so does the rate of growth to the point where you're adding more and more biomass onto that tree. And as you add biomass, that's carbon, half of it's carbon. And the rest of it's leaves and needles and such, branches and so forth. But half of it's carbon when you look at the biomass accumulation. The slide on the left is from David Mildrexler et al.'s project that they did on the east side. Bev Law was involved in that too. And you can see what happens in those dry forests in the different conifer species as they get above about 50 centimeters diameter or 21 inches diameter breast height, their annual rate of carbon accumulation shoots up. And so if you set that vertical line further out to the right, you're going to be losing a lot of carbon. So a good place to set it, at least for the east side forest, is 21 inches, corresponds to roughly 80 years or so, depending on the site index, and you're picking up carbon. If you move it further over to the right, you're going to be losing a lot of carbon to logging. So that's why this is really important to look at the annual rate of accumulation, which shoots up as these trees get bigger and older. Next slide. So here are the choices that we face. A natural climate solution on the left, and a carbon dioxide source of atmospheric pollution on the right. And on the left, the old growth carbon sinks are storing about 35 to 70% more carbon than the log forests. On the right, those forests are going to sequester when they come back, but there's a dead zone of at least 10 years when there's not enough, net primary productivity in those stands to even matter. So you've created these dead zones where there's no sequestration occurring. And even as they ramp up, they don't have the carbon stores. And you sent a lot of that into the atmosphere, as you'll see in the next series of slides. Next slide. So, okay, again, getting back to my bucket list, about a decade ago, I said, why can't we get a mature and old-growth forest map for the United States? Why not? And so, Pan et al. And their colleagues back in 2011, using FIA data sets, did this really nice map of the North America content, showing, the circled areas, the blue colors are where, what we're calling mature and old growth. And you can see where they're distributed. This is a really good project. It was a good job, but it needs to be updated. It's based on 2006 FIA plot data sets at a 1 kilometer scale resolution. Every plot is about 6,000 acres apart. Their centers are about 12 miles apart. So it's pretty coarse, but it's useful. And now we've got LiDAR. So, wow, wouldn't it be cool if we could combine the two, which is what we did in our study, which is what you're going to see. Next slide. All right, so we talk a lot about age, but what I'm going to shift now to is not an age-based approach. It's a structure-based approach. And it's using 3 proxies or indicators of maturation. And that is all derived from remote sensing. Thank you, NASA. And then some of it's been ground truthed, as you've learned. You'll see in the next series of slides. Thank you, FIA. But you can see we're operating at a very fine scale of resolution, 30 megapixels. It's 100 feet on the side compared to over 3,000 feet on the side, which is what the Pan et al. Project did with the FIA data sets. So LiDAR, having that now, has just been such a blessing and an advancement in our ability to see down to individual trees from space. It's really phenomenal. One day I got on Google Earth, just as an aside here, and I saw my dad going out to his mailbox for his mail in Florida. So this is the kind of resolution we have now. Some of it's scary, but we can see it down now to the individual tree level. And that's a big advancement over what Pan et al. Were using. And so we've got these 3 proxies. We've got tree height, we got canopy cover, and we've got a published data set of living above ground biomass. So we have the computer rank order all the pixels based on an ordinal scale of low to high structural development. Then those scores are summed for the 3 proxies, and the ones with the highest scores win. They're mature and old growth. Now, we didn't have enough resources to sort mature from old growth. That would have taken another analysis, so we just lumped them into the highest scores of mature and old growth. And you're going to see those findings as we go forward. Next slide. And this really is the first ever map. So structurally mature, in our case, includes old growth, and it's the combination of the tallest trees, densest canopies, and most above ground living biomass. That gives you the highest scores, that gives you the map. It's spatially explicit. We have it for every ecoregion, every forest type, using the SAF data set of forest groups. We have it for every state, every landowner, down to 30 megapixels. Then we do the overlays using the USGS land use gap designations and gap classifications. I actually was involved in this originally 2 decades ago with CBI. We put this data set together, the US Protected Areas data set, and it has these gap codes. Gap 1 is the strictest level of protection. You can see examples there. Gap 2 is, a little lesser, state parks, national monuments, but it's still protected. Gap 3 is multiple use. Gap 4 is converted to other uses. Now, what do you do with roadless areas? Now, in the gap classifications, they would be put into gap code 3, but we didn't think that that was a fair assessment because they do have a notch above multiple use, but we all know they're not inviolate. They've been overturned by at least two states, and Alaska's tried many times to overturn it. Trump overturned it. Bush overturned it. There's been 14, I think, appellate court decisions on it. So it's not inviolate. It needs to be bumped up in protection status. And we could talk about how that might come about. We also overlaid onto those data set ecosystem services. This came out of a discussion I had with USDA. They said, well, yeah, carbon's important, but what about drinking water? Okay, how about if we use your faucets, your forest to faucets drinking water data set? Okay, cool. And so we did. We got that to show as well as carbon. And then NatureServe, which is a co-PI on this project, gave us all their imperiled species and imperiled ecosystems data sets, and we overlaid those as well. And then all of this information is going to be uploaded onto a website that's under construction now. We kind of ran out of funding, but we're trying to get as much of it in play as we can now so we can share this with everybody, including NGOs, the federal government, anybody that's interested in this. And you're going to see some really cool zoom-ins here pretty soon. Next slide. Okay, so here's a full snapshot of the forest development classes across the United States using this system of ranking the 3 proxies. The hot colors are the least structurally developed. The warm colors are the most structurally developed. And we're going to zoom in on this in a minute, so bear with me. Just wanted to point out that we're looking at the entire range of structural class developments based on those 3 proxies, the sum of their scores, and it's all relative. It's relative to their nearest proxy. So what is scored as mature and old growth in the Northeast, you can't compare that with what's been scored in the Sierra. It's, it's a different kind of relative proxy setting. However, you can compare that to the surroundings and say, yeah, that's mature and old growth. It pencils out. Next slide. Okay, so we broadly group these into 3 structural classifications. Structurally young, and we did partition out areas that were disturbed by fire and insects versus areas disturbed by logging, and that's in the methods paper. That was a huge effort to do. Intermediate and mature and old growth. So those are 3 kind of broad classifications, but keep in mind, this is a gradient, it's continuous data. I'm just breaking it up into discontinuous, discrete classes for simplification here. And the young is in red, the intermediate's in orange, and the mature is in green. So that kind of gives you a snapshot of the 3 classes roughly. Let's go to the next slide. And what we did, and this is where FIA comes in beautifully. I mean, we looked at hundreds of thousands of FIA plots that overlapped with our mapped polygons. What you see are 6 forest types. We did this for all forest types, but 6 forest types here, and this is in the methods paper. On the left of those figures is what the FIA would classify forest as pole, mature, and late. On the right of those graphs are what we modeled with our 3 proxies. And you can see in these box plots, there's a lot of overlap there. That's a good thing. And that to us is model validation, which is really important. We also held regional workshops in 8 different regions of the country. We brought together NGOs, researchers, state and federal government folks, and said, hey, did we get this right? And so we had to tweak the model until folks were happy with the results that we got. And you're going to see some of that now. So there were a couple of validation steps here that got us to these maps that are coming forward. It's not perfect, but it's pretty darn close. It's good enough. Next slide. All right, drum roll. Here you go. This is a map, the first ever coast-to-coast map of mature and old growth forest of the conterminous United States. And when you see that big M there, that's million. So 36% of all the forest development classes were in the mature and old growth classification. That's roughly 166 million acres across all landowners. Now, when you break that out, about 35% of the mature and old growth is on federal lands. When you break that out further, most of it's on national forest. Now, you can see when you sum that up, it's not 100% national forest, BLM, national parks. There's some slop in the data sets. But by and large, national forests win the prize. on having the majority mature and old growth, but the BLM is also important. And this kind of ties into the Paris Agreement, when it talks about countries need to protect and enhance their sinks and reservoirs of carbon. Well, this is it, folks. This is the conterminous United States sinks and reservoirs of carbon. And as the United States puts together its nationally determined contributions to the Paris Climate Agreement, these need to be in there as natural climate solutions, along with emissions reductions. Next slide. And the numbering that you saw there was from different regions. So we zoom into any one of these regions and we can get it down to individual forests anywhere in the country. On the left, you see the strictly protected or relaxed, moderate protected, gap 1 and 2, with the green and mature and old growth. On the right, in the kind of yellow color, you see the gap 3. Those are unprotected, mature forests that don't make it into any protected system. So where you've got the overlap of the green and the yellow is where you've got mature and old growth in unprotected landscapes. Next slide. Okay, what to do about roadless areas? I'm glad you're thinking about that, because I've been thinking about it for a long time. And so what you see on this slide is the mature forest on federal lands, and in the kind of orange color, the roadless areas. And there is an overlap there, and it's significant. I think it's something like 22% of the mature forest is in the roadless classification, gap 2.5. So that could be some low-hanging fruit. If we can bump up the protections there, we can get some additional protection into that carbon reserve and sink approach of the Paris Climate Agreement. Next slide. And so I've been working with a lot of the groups around the country on this. There was a lot of interest in the 5-state region that includes the Northern Rockies Ecosystem Protection Act. And you know, this is based on Mike Bader's map of those 5 states. He wanted to know, well, how many acres of old growth do I have in my proposed protected area? Well, the whole 5-state region in the West is 195 million acres. Of the 195 million, about 18.8 million acres are mature and old growth based on our definition, roughly 10%. And only 20% of that is in the protected areas category. So Carol King and I went in front of the Natural Resources Committee in March and testified on this and said, you know, this is why we need to protect these landscapes. They've got a lot of carbon, water, biodiversity, and you know, they're not protected. So we can zoom into any place and do these kinds of overlays. And this is a case study that's in one of our papers. Next slide. All right, so now what does it look like? And so when we did our regional workshops, we were zooming into different regions to say, hey, did we get it right? And so, you know, this is classic old growth Sierra mixed conifer. And, you know, many people have seen these kinds of forests. They walk in it and say, yeah, no question, this is old growth. Next slide. Aha, what about this? So Upper Peninsula of Michigan comes out as mature, and it's relative to its surroundings. And it's important. It's important to those groups that are working in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. They sent me this slide and said, this is what we're trying to fight to protect. Next slide. Bottomland hardwood forest in the Congareen National Park. We spent a lot of time on this in the regional workshops because the map, the remote sensing wasn't picking this up accurately. And so we had to make some adjustments that then satisfied the groups that we were picking up these forests that weren't initially coming in the way we were doing the proxies. But we've now got it down where we can see what they were concerned about. And, you know, we did this in 8 different regions. Next slide. Dry mesic oak forest and woodland in North Carolina, I mean, the north central part of the country. It's considered mature. And, you know, we're not just focused on conifer forest. If it's mature, it's mature. Doesn't matter what the major type is, as long as it has the carbon, the biodiversity, and the water, it counts. Next slide. And I actually misspelled that. It should be hardwood hammock forest. I took this photograph. I went down to Florida to see my family and said, I got to get some pictures of these, forests in Florida, because, most people don't think about mature and old growth forest in Florida. And this is, remnants of what's left out in the Florida Peninsula. Next slide. And you've got remnants of the bold cypress trees, and most of those were logged out, but they show up on our inventory as important. Next slide. And thanks to Zach Porter, he sent me this one of low elevation conifer hardwood stands in mature forest that they're concerned about. And so you can see there's a big difference in the tree sizes of these forests, but it's all relative, and that's how we're using a relative structural classification system for mature. Now, the next step in this is what I'm working on with Richard Birdsey, is we're going to crosswalk these data sets with the FIA plots and pull out the age and diameter distributions of what we're calling mature to get a final resolution on this. It's a work in progress right now. Next slide. Okay, so how much do we protect? Because humanity's footprint is getting bigger and bigger, and this, triggering the biggest unprecedented decline of biodiversity around the planet. And the Brundtland report in 1987, which set up the international standard of 17%, that ain't going to do it. The G7 countries, which include the United States, set up this target of 30 by 30. Maybe that'll do it. Half Earth, E.O. Wilson was really the vanguard of this, and Nature Needs Half, Harvey Locke in Canada, the big vanguard on this. But it actually goes back to 2012, where Reed Noss, myself, and a bunch of other folks, we pulled together all the regional analyses out there, and that's what you see with that graph there, means and variance around the means of how much researchers were saying needed to be protected. And we settled on 50%. That needs to be the kind of goalpost. And it's going to vary depending on the ecoregion. Some places it's not going to be nearly enough. In other places it might do the job. So in our analysis, we set up three thresholds of protection: 30%, 50%, and 100% of mature forests, and actually on all lands, just to kind of see where things were in the conterminous United States. So kind of keep that in mind. We're looking at three thresholds of what constitutes protected. Next slide. And that means protected from logging, by the way. All right, here's a good summary slide. The main thing to pay attention to here are the horizontal lines. The lower one is 30%, the upper one is 50%, and of course there's 100%. The green colors are protected. The other colors are not protected. And these are by landowner. And for national forests, mature forests come in at about 24% in gap 1 and gap 2. 54% of it's in gap 3 out there that could be logged. And if the IRAs or the roadless areas are improved, that number bumps up to 45% on the national forests. So national forests currently are not even meeting the lower bound. They could get close to the mid bound if roadless areas were actually bumped up to 2, and we want them at 100%, and you'll learn why as we go forward. BLM, interestingly, had a similar percentage, 24 in gap 1 and 2. The rest of it's in gap 3. There's no IRA policy on BLM lands. There's the National Landscape Conservation System, but that takes presidential or Congress to nominate those lands to the NLCS. But there may be a way to do that, but BLM needs to be considered in this as well. Tribal has some, but most of it's not protected. Family private has a bunch, but it's mostly not protected. State was kind of interesting. I think we were picking up a lot of the state parks, but clearly there's a lot of logging going on state lands. Next slide. I don't expect you to understand this slide. It's just up there as, hey, we got it for every single national forest with the 2 horizontal lines. And in the green are the protected areas. So we could click on any one of these national forests and tell you how much mature and old growth is present, how much mature and old growth is in gap 1 and 2, and how much is in gap 3. And that's what this is. It's for every national forest that has forest in it. And that's in an online appendix in our manuscript. Next slide. Okay, so in a nutshell, what really jumps out are the federal lands. And this is the best place to conserve, protect from logging mature and old growth forests. I don't have time to go into all the numbers, but the federal lands had the most imperiled ecosystems, the most imperiled species, the highest amounts of carbon, that is the most above ground living biomass, and the best drinking water. So as far as a climate strategy, that is ground zero for natural climate solutions. Federal lands are also some of the last tracts of old growth redwood, cypress, longleaf pine, wiregrass communities. So, a conservation strategy really needs to be anchored in the federal lands protections. There's a lot of drinking water that's out there that's at risk to logging, that's in mature forest. You can see the numbers there. Interestingly, there are places around the country that are maturing and that should be protected to allow old growth characteristics to develop over time. But there's 50 million acres hanging out there in gap 3, vulnerable to logging. Only 24% is protected. We're not even meeting the base floor. We could get closer to it if roadless areas were bumped up, but it really needs to be the upper bound. And upper bound is all federal mature forests need to be in a conservation reserve system where it's protected from logging. Next slide. And when I testified with Carole King last March, there was a lot of concern about what to do about wildfire resilience. And there were statements being made that the Forest Service doesn't log mature and old growth anymore. And thankfully, the Climate Forest Coalition put together this report of 10 examples of places around the country on Forest Service and BLM lands that had big trees being logged. And it's not just the Western United States, it's across the whole country. It's just the tip of the iceberg. As noted in my gap analysis, over 50 million acres are actually vulnerable. They could be logged and not in any protected area system. Next slide. So here are the choices to remind everybody. Natural climate solutions on the left, you pick up 50 million acres of mature forest and you secure 5.8 gigatons of biomass carbon. That's a lot of carbon. If those forests are logged in a decade, which it would be really pushing it, but we did have President Trump who was talking about massive increases in federal lands logging. So in a worst case scenario, if that happened within a decade, that would be the equivalent release of 18% of US carbon dioxide emissions that would increase parts per million in the atmosphere by 1 part per million. Doesn't sound like a lot, but you've seen we've already, way exceeded 350. So the flip side of this is you protect those forests, you avoid those emissions. And that's what a lot of the global community of scientists is saying. We've got to avoid emissions and not just look at net sequestration. We don't need to keep treating the atmosphere as a dumping ground for carbon dioxide. Next slide. I'm just going to leave one slide on the Tongass because, I love the Tongass. I've been working up there for 30 years, and this is some work we did with Woodwell that was published, I think, in March as well. I think it was in the journal Land. But anyway, this is the carbon and old growth champ in the National Forest System. About 88% of the original old growth is still there. So there's an opportunity to really change things on the Tongass as a national model. It represents 9% of the total national forest land area, has 16% of the inventory roadless areas, and get this, that single national forest has 20% of the carbon stored of all the national forest system. So clearly is a champ. Just under half is in old growth, just under half is in the roadless areas. So protecting both of those are critically important. We had an emissions calculation that we did in there, estimating over a century of logging, released the equivalent of over 9 million vehicle emissions. So that's not the direction you want to keep going on the Tongass or any other forest with mature and old growth. Next slide. All right, you hear a lot about fire. So yeah, we protect these big trees. Aren't they all going to burn up? Well, as the tree size increases, so does the resistance to fire, and their bark builds up a natural kind of insulation They can withstand light to moderate burning, and even some conifers can withstand it in their canopy. Trees that look like they're dead after a fire actually flush the spring after. They're classified as dead. They're salvage logged, but we're learning through the work that JMP has done and other researchers that they're flushing in the spring. And this is an adaptation that they have. And a lot of these trees also need fire, even giant sequoia. These become museum relics. We love those 360-foot giant sequoia trees, but if they're not reproducing in the understory, goodbye sequoia, especially as the climate resets. So I don't see it as a catastrophe when those big trees burn. Clearly, we need to protect them from logging, but if a fire occurs through those areas, it's a chance for them to regenerate. And it's sad to see them, the giants burn, but they have mechanisms in place. Next slide. I just have to point out the circularity of forest succession. When I was in grad school, we talked about forest succession as being a linear process. You went from young to old. It's not linear, it's circular. And even within a stand, you can have an old growth stand with a canopy disturbance and it resets the successional clock. And the slide on the left is where I trained for 30 years of what a forest is. The slide on the right, only the last 10 years, I've learned, holy cow, these forests are equally biodiverse. And guess what? You can't have the left unless you have the right. You can't have the right unless you have the left. It's all joined together. And going in and salvage logging it is just going to destroy that intimate connection between life and death in these forests. Next slide. And here's why. So the intimate connection is you get a mature forest, it can burn severely in a fire. It becomes a complex early cereal forest or snag forest, which is as biodiverse as the original old growth forest, or at least the old growth forest. I can't say it's original, but it was at least as biodiverse. Now, salvage logging comes in there and it disrupts that cycle. It plants trees, it takes out the biological legacies. And now you got an intense burn the next time and you don't have structure, you cook the soils, you disrupt those natural processes. The slide on the right top is a beautiful complex early cereal forest with tons of woodpeckers and even owls and hawks nesting in it. The slide on the bottom is from the rimfire salvage. And that's what they're turning those mature forests that have gone through fire into. And we're going to protect these mature forests. We got to protect them across the successional gradient, the circularity, because they're dynamic ecosystems. Next slide. A lot of concern about this, and I don't need to tell people, but again, when I was a grad student, we learned the fire behavior triangle is influenced by fuel, which a lot of us call vegetation, topography, and climate. And it was assumed it was mostly an equilateral triangle. No more now. The top-down driver now is climate change. So what you do from bottom up is having less and less significance. It's becoming irrelevant because the top-down driver is climate change. Next slide. And here's the new studies that have been coming out. And Curtis Bradley and myself and Chad published this paper back in 2016, where we looked at where were the high severity fires mostly occurring in. And that bar graph you see there has the most high severity fire on the private lands where most of the logging was happening. And in the protected lands, it was burning more like a mixed severity mosaic, the way nature designed it to. And after that study came out, a number of other studies have shown that it's the combination of industrial logging and extreme fire weather triggered by climate change that's giving us these big fires. And so that's something to consider when we're protecting mature and old growth forests and trees. We're not getting in the way of altering fire behavior for more severe fire. If anything, we're preparing the forest better for these big fires. Next slide. All right, what happens when we log a forest? You hear all kinds of misinformation, disinformation about we store carbon in wood products, we plant trees, so everything's hunky-dory. It's net sequestration, that's all we're concerned about. But no, it's not net sequestration, it's additional emissions to the atmosphere. And in a climate emergency, you can't be putting emissions into the atmosphere, even if you have a net sink. That's what a lot of us are saying now. The IPCC scientists are saying, it's game over unless we change this dynamic. And it turns out that only about 20% of that carbon works its way from the tree into the product. Within 100 years, it's either in the atmosphere or it's in the landfill. So that's not the place we want to be putting our carbon. Next slide. And you start out with a primary and old growth forest with all that carbon, and then you hear claims, well, we plant 3 trees for every one we log, and then we log again. Well, you never get back up to the original carbon that was accumulated in that old growth forest. You have that loss over large landscapes. Whether you plant or whether it comes back itself, it's an emission. And you can't discount it by saying it's a net sink, because you've already emitted all of that carbon that came from the primary forest. Next slide. And this accumulates over space and temporal scales. So the more we do this, the more emissions we put out in the atmosphere. And when you look at it at a big scale, the data that are out there show that across the country, emissions from logging over a decade period were 5 times greater than that of wildfires, insects, and storms, windstorms combined. So you hear all the concern about fire emissions, but really what the bigger emissions are coming from logging at scale. Next slide. Okay, I think this is my last couple of slides, and then we can open up for questions. So, the Secretary's memo said bold action, but I still don't know what that means, unfortunately, with this administration, but we have an opportunity to influence that. And, it was in a similar situation, many of us were, when Clinton was the president. And, the roadless rule came about at the time because we had 2 very good inventory mapping projects. We had a lot of pressure that was being applied to the White House because they signed the Rescissions Act, which opened up the door for massive post-fire logging and timber sales in old growth forest. And so I think the roadless policy came about because there was good leadership there, and it was, repentance from guilt of, turning over all of these forests to logging. And so we did get roadless, which was massive, 58.5 million acres went into roadless conservation. Now it's not gap 2, but it's important nonetheless. And so here we have 50 million acres of mature and old growth. Let's think on that scale. And let's think on the scale that the protection matters, that we don't have to go back years from now and clean this mess up, which is what's been going on over and over with the roadless policy. It really needs to be tighter protections. We need national rulemaking, and we need a good faith gesture to suspend the logging in those threatened timber sales. And I'll go back to the Clinton roadless policy again. Before that policy was enacted, before there was an EIS, a number of us leaned on the White House and said, good faith gesture, put a moratorium on any new road buildings so they allow the DEIS to go forward, the impact statement. And they did, to their credit. So we're asking the same thing now. Put a moratorium on those sales, pull the plug on them while this process goes forward, the year-long process. And by the way, it shouldn't take a year. We need to have a policy moving at a parallel rate. It needs to be moving at the same time that this inventory process is taking place, because the clock's running out on a first-term Biden administration. The Secretary's memo calls for planting 1 billion trees. It's not gonna be as important, folks. The best way to store carbon is in the big trees. They've already had a big jump on sequestration and storage. Those little seedlings are going to take a long time to start ramping up and storing carbon. 1 billion trees is not compensatory for protecting what we've already got out there. And if we don't protect it, we're putting more emissions into the atmosphere. We want to be on the side of the natural climate solutions. Next slide. Okay, so this is my wrap-up slide. A lot of us are saying T minus 10 years and counting, folks. We're approaching, if not have already crossed, critical planetary boundaries, thresholds. There have been papers published on this. Planetary boundary thresholds have already been crossed, and many of us now feeling the climate threshold's been crossed. That doesn't mean that we can't slow it down or make sure that it doesn't get a lot worse, but it is going to get worse because there's a lag in the system. So we've got to keep the so-called dinosaur carbon in the ground at the same time that we're storing atmospheric carbon in these older forests, the 51 million acres or so that we mapped. When you do that, you get biodiversity and ecosystem services, including water. We've documented it now. In addition, it's not a complete strategy. We need to reduce the anthropogenic stressors to allow species to migrate across an increasingly inhospitable landscape, and that, connect the ecosystems, connectivity, identification of climate refugia. Most of those are mature and old growth forests. And there are other climate refugia that need to be out there on that landscape to allow species to find a place to weather this coming climate storm. And then reduce forestry emissions, particularly on private lands. You could do that through incentivizing longer rotations and improved practices. But this is the kind of moonshot that we absolutely have to have right away if we're going to avoid major catastrophic and collapsing ecosystems that are going to reverberate on every aspect of society. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to end with a pitch for my new book that is Scientists Speaking Out for Climate and Biodiversity. There's lots of chapters in there from scientists that have taken the plunge and that are taking their science to the streets, that are getting it in front of decision makers. We need more scientists doing this in defense of nature, particularly in the biodiversity and climate crises that we currently find ourselves in. And I'll just leave those two links up there. I think the coalition sponsors may want to talk a little bit more about that for submitting comments. And as I mentioned early on in the discussion, that the comment period has been extended by 15 days, thankfully, as many of us are racing to put this information together. All right, so I'm going to flip it back over to, I guess it's Alex that's handling the Q&A.
Yeah, I think Paul and I are both going to be trading off, asking you some questions. Thanks so much, Tom. That's a lot of information. And we've got a number of questions that have come in. I think I wanted to start with just several folks have asked if any of your slides can be made available. We are recording the webinar and we will send that out in the next week. But as far as like some of the specific slides and graphics, I know folks are planning to write some action alerts and things, and I think we'd love to have access to those. Is that a possibility?
I think it is. I have to be kind of careful because this isn't peer review. It cannot wind up on any kind of website because that counts as a pre-publication. So I think if you kind of consider that this is a pre-peer review version of the two manuscripts, that it is preliminary because it needs to go through that process. I'm happy to share that information. Just please don't post it anywhere.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dominic. Janine L asks that has a question. The language and standards mentioned by the Biden administration seem to be written either by or with the help of logging industry. Multiple times forest products are mentioned and like climate smart forestry. And since fires are mentioned repeatedly, and she says we know the faulty prevailing messages of what causes fires and thinning being used for healthy forests, isn't it possible this language is more of a precursor for business as usual or even an increased logging potential? And notes that she finds the words worrying and not comforting.
Yeah, I think, it's really important for people to get these concerns into the Federal Register notice because the agency is going through this right now. And I know a number of folks have been on the NGO discussions with the federal agencies. They're doing a really good job of at least communicating with folks. And there's a number of us that are going to be on the science panel one coming up here shortly as well. So I think this is an information gathering time, and it's time to kind of get these concerns out. I've got a lot of the same concerns too. Like, what do they mean by climate smart forestry? What do they mean by resilience? And why did logging not show up as a threat when wildfire, natural disturbances, and climate change are listed repeatedly in all the announcements, but it's like they're hiding behind the logging threat, and that needs to be daylighted. And that's hopefully what we can all do, particularly the information that we've put forward in my presentation, to really kind of show that these natural disturbances are going to happen in these forests regardless of what we do, particularly in a changing climate. But the best hope we've got for sustaining biodiversity and ecosystem services in these forests is to just not tinker with them. We've got so many other places we're tinkering with. This is not a big chunk of land. And it's a place that can anchor the conservation strategy of America the Beautiful as the administration goes forward with their 30 by 30 analysis.
Thanks. There's a couple questions in here about age limits for determining mature and old growth. Heather asked if trees can become biologically mature, can reproduce younger than 80 years old. Why would we not want to lower the age cutoff or limit or threshold for mature and old growth? And relatedly, Katya asked, what's the difference impact on choosing, different years as far as like 60 to 80 years for your data being the threshold for mature and old growth versus some who use 100 or 120 years?
Yeah, a number of us have been working with Richard Birdsey, NRDC and company, been working with Richard on this, running a bunch of FIA plot data metrics on CMAI as a function of carbon. And, you could slide the scale either way, you're going to get a different answer depending on where you are. So we kind of felt like 80 was a reasonable compromise, or in fact, what we used was DBH more than age in those assessments. And in some places like the coastal forest of Oregon, I mean, you'll get mature, you'll get the CMAI, the culmination of mean annual increment, at a smaller diameter class and a smaller age class. And in the drier forest, you'll get it culminating at a larger diameter and an older age. So we kind of picked 80 as kind of the happy sweet spot that would pick up the bulk of carbon. If those stands were protected, would get the majority of the carbon. And this kind of jives with some of the work that David Miles-Rexler and company have done too, with that one figure that I showed you. When the trees get above 21 inches, and I'm switching between DBH and age, but when they get above 21, they really shoot up. And so if you slide that DBH or the age threshold closer to 100, closer to 120, now you're compromising carbon. And that carbon's going to the atmosphere. And if you slide it too far to the left, then you're not getting really the ramp up of carbon that you see as they kind of hit that sweet spot. So it's not perfect by any means, but it's a reasonable approach to getting at this standard of what should count and what's enforceable, because every forester knows how to drill a tree with an increment borer, and every forester knows how to measure a tree with a diameter tape. So it's enforceable, it can be measured, you can come up with how much carbon you're saving in those forests if you just generally shoot for the 80.
Great, thank you. Katya asks also about drier forests, and so maybe expanding on some of those ideas. Her question is, can you explain how drier forests like pinyon juniper and ponderosa forests compare in carbon capture and their value to combat climate change? We tend to focus on wetter forests, perhaps because of how fast they grow, but many of these drier forests in the US are hundreds of years old.
Yeah, great question. Thanks for bringing that up. I'll be honest, I am not an expert on juniper. It's, the juniper pinyon pine ecosystem is important and it does reach maturation. It's in our data set somewhere. And honestly, I would have to go back in and pull that out because I'm not as familiar with that ecosystem. And again, it is important. But, I keep coming back to David Miles-Rexler's work for Eastern Oregon. That was mostly in the dry forest, the dry pine, the dry mixed conifers. And that one figure that I showed you, when the trees get above 21 inches DBH, the carbon shoots up. So it is important in mature and old growth. And Bev Law and her studies have further confirmed that those dry forests are important too. It's not all just the wet forest. That's why it needs to be a relative measure, the relative importance with your nearest neighbor forest type or age class. This way, all forests are important on a relative basis. And the mature ones have the most carbon on a relative basis. So that you don't just protect the wet forest, the giant, sequoia trees or the Sierra mixed conifer giants, but you're protecting the ones that count as mature within that forest type, within that place of interest.
Dominic, we had a question about carbon credits and whether you think carbon credits for forests will have a positive results as far as protecting maturing forests, or are carbon credits just a scam to continue industrial logging and pollution?
Yes and no. It depends. It's incredibly controversial. I know a lot of my colleagues that work with IPCC folks and then work on the climate, more the climate side, think it's not going to help much. But I kind of look at it as it could be a conservation tool if it's done correctly to protect some forests. So you have to make sure that it's verifiable and that you are above the business as usual, so that instead of cutting down the forest, you're protecting it, or instead of cutting it down every 35 years, you're extending it out 70 years, 80-year rotations. And, you know, Bev Law has done that computation for the Pacific Northwest, and it's part of her land use strategy for carbon in the non-federal land. So I think it could work there. Is it going to save us? Is it going to be the climate saver? No. And even protecting all these forests won't. There are limits. Nature can only do so much. The terrestrial side forests, they're a real big part of the climate solution. The oceans also absorbing carbon, but there are consequences. I mean, the oceans are acidifying because of too much carbon. And forests can only handle so much. And in many places, we're seeing them now switch from a sink to a source of carbon because they're dying back from the heat and the drought. So we've got to do everything we possibly can on this moonshot. And if that means working with non-federal landowners to improve their stewardship, so be it. They should get a carbon credit, but I don't expect that to be the, you know, the magic bullet or the magic wand in any of this, but it's important.
Great, thank you. Dan asks, does the Inflation Reduction Act address mature old growth forests? And if so, how?
All right, so I'm gonna flip this to Jen. Are you on still? You might want to take this one.
I am on. Why don't you take another question? I'll see if I can dig it up, but I don't believe so.
I think it does old growth, but not mature. If I'm not mistaken, in the negotiations, Manchin took out mature, and old growth is in there, but not mature.
All right. In the meantime, maybe I'm going to go ahead and ask Matthew's question is, national forests have harvest quotas assigned to them. Is there any move to get this changed?
Well, I mean, the thinking here is it needs to be top down, just like the roadless rule was top down and said you got to protect roadless areas all through the United States on national forests. We need a national rulemaking that says mature and old growth forests are the places that we need to really be anchoring our biodiversity, our water, and our carbon strategy. And that becomes the direction that's then handed down to all the national forests as they go forward with their plans. So I think that's the way to tackle it. That's my hope anyhow, that this will provide the guidance, the top-down guidance direction, just like, you know, rulemaking does whenever it's done. You know, the federal government does rulemaking often, and that provides the guidance that all the national forests then have to tier off of.
Do you have any mapping data for Alaska?
Well, I did show the Tongass data, the Tongass work that we did. That's published. It's using a different approach, not the one that you saw in the conterminous United States. But yes, we do have that. We've got the carbon inventoried by all kinds of different management systems, roadless, old growth, the Tongass 77 watersheds, lands that have been logged, young growth. So we've got those data sets too. We just used a different methodology.
Great. And there's a little further clarification about maybe you can say more about what folks can use from the information from this webinar while constructing comments to the agencies and the administration.
Yeah, I think probably the best way to do this, contact me individually, and I will send that with the requisite that it doesn't wind up on anybody's website, because that would be hard. I'm also working with my own set of comments. I think I'm up to like 30 pages already, and I haven't even added the citation list yet. I'm glad we've got another 15 days, but contact me offline, and I can make that available as well.
There's a question about biomass here as well. Katie asked, it's hard to understand why biomass energy is being resisted by some sectors. I can understand the reluctance to allow for forests being cut in order to produce biomass energy, but if biomass fuel can use waste from sawmills, other paper waste, even plastic waste and pellets, why is that a bad thing if it can help get smaller rural communities in particular off oil and gas? Really trying to understand this issue from a carbon perspective, but also from a practical and economic perspective. Do you have anything to say to that?
I've done a lot of work with the scientific community on biomass, and it's not the best way to go. In fact, it could produce more emissions than an equivalent amount of energy coming from coal. And so it's not a substitute. In fact, it could be worse. And it's because it's so inefficient to burn pellets, and it's led to almost a complete deforestation of the southeastern United States. It's become kind of the biopellets basket, where those forests that were some of the most biodiverse forests in the temperate zone in the world have been type converted to fast-growing trees that are then placed into biopellets, with the emissions not only going into the atmosphere causing problems for climate change, but a lot of the BIPOC communities are downwind of those pellet manufacturing places, and the rural communities, I would argue, are going to suffer reduced air quality in those places. In addition, we're now seeing whole trees that are ground up into biopellets. I just finished a project, for example, in the British Columbia inland rainforest, where using the red listed ecosystem criteria, we documented that the primary forest in that region, which is a pretty large region, right, pressed up against the Rocky Mountains of Canada, and some of the oldest old growth rainforest trees on the planet. They were taking whole tree logs from salvage operations, grinding them into pellets, putting them on barges, sending them across the Panama Canal over to European markets. And Drax was the biomanufacturing plant that was marketing that as clean renewable energy. And it makes people like me crazy. I mean, even if it was penciling out in terms of BTUs, you're still shipping it in immense distances, expending fossil fuels to get it to European markets, and you're putting more emissions into the atmosphere. You're destroying the forest. They eat forest alive. The chip mills have it's been estimated by Tara Herdeberg and some of her work at the University of Idaho, that if you put one of these plants in place, you're looking at forest degradation over a 250-mile radius to feed those manufacturing plants. It's not a harmless activity. They're not just using wood waste. They're taking whole trees and grinding them into biopellets for use as clean renewable energy. And you had Drax, one of the big users of that product, sponsored the legislation. I've never heard of a company sponsoring congressional legislation. Only congressional members can co-sponsor legislation, but they were right in front sponsoring that legislation because the federal subsidies are going to benefit those corporate industries that are polluting the environment for BIPOC communities and putting more emissions into the atmosphere. So we've got to get off of that. It's as bad, if not worse, than burning coal.
John says, great presentation. The data you showed were relative metrics, which are without a doubt valuable, but also absolute merits are equally valuable in different contexts. Have you produced these same maps, however, using absolute metrics?
Yeah, great question. And stay tuned, because we've got a project right now with Richard Birdsey, NRDC, and Woodwell Climate Research Center, where we're doing that crosswalk. And the tricky part is the FIA plots, as good as they are, and they are really good. This is so good to have that data from the USDA, the Forest Inventory Analysis plots. They're fuzzy locations, so they don't overlap exactly with a point on the ground and the pixel that we've mapped. But our polygons are big enough that we're going to get overlap. I showed you that one box chart with hundreds of thousands of plots that we had overlapping with what we were mapping in those different structural classes. Well, we're now taking aim at those specific, those absolute measures. So places that, for example, we were calling mature, what are the diameter distributions of those trees look like? What are the age of those trees? How much carbon is in those based on the FIA data set? So it's a huge project. It's just getting started. We hope to have something in peer review in the months ahead.
Another question here that came in, is there, go. Oh, on your slides, it says, one of your slides, it said that 35% of mature and old growth forests are on federal lands. Jessica said, I thought you said 85% were on federal lands. Can you clarify?
Yeah, it's kind of a nested design. So you start out with how much is out there on the continental United States, and that's 166 million acres. And so that represents about 36% of all the structural forest classes across the US, which is a larger number acreage-wise. And then of that, 35% of the mature forest is federal lands. But federal lands include the national forests, the BLM, national parks, for example. And so of that 35%, 88 or 90%, I think, was national forest of the federal mature. About 9% was BLM of the federal mature, and about 3% is National Park Service of the federal mature. So just kind of whittling down that process of how much and who owns it. I hope that makes sense.
Thanks. Linda asks, thoughts on tree planting charities? Too little, too late, or is there value in raising awareness? Could this activism be better channeled?
Yeah, everybody loves tree planting, and certainly the urban environment would be a great place. We know that there are some really nasty heat islands out there. People live in DC, people live in Atlanta, New York City, and those are major heat islands. You can get 5 to 10 degrees hotter in those landscapes, those skyscrapes, whatever they are, concrete scapes. And so in an urban ecology setting, yes, it's really important to do that, and we should be doing that. But, I think the planting of 1 trillion trees has been analyzed. There's been counterpoint in Science Magazine about it. It can help, but I don't think it's going to help as much as people think it's going to help. And it competes with other uses. Like, where are you going to plant 1 trillion trees? If you take up agricultural land, what about food? What kind of trees? Are you using natives or are you using exotics? And they take a long time to start capturing carbon, sequestering it, and building up their carbon stocks. So there's a lag. And the best thing we need to be doing, in my opinion, where we need to be putting our activism is in a hierarchy of needs, so to speak. You protect what you already have out there. First and foremost, the mature and old growth forests that we already have a big startup on any little tiny seedling. Those need to be protected. And then, the next need is you reform forestry practices to put less emissions into the atmosphere on the places that you're not protecting. And whether you do that through regulations or through incentives, that needs to happen. If forests are going to reduce, or forestry is going to reduce its emissions load to the atmosphere, then there's afforestation and reforestation. Afforestation refers to planting trees like on fallow agricultural lands and then using those to capture carbon. Reforestation means planting it where you've logged, and in the case of the tropics, for instance. But often reforestation is coupled to logging. Like, for example, in post-fire logging operations, they take out the most important biological legacies, the live and dead trees, which are going to restart the forest, give you the complexity, early cereal snag forest. They take those out and they plant trees. And in a lot of those places, the trees cook from solar radiation, too much sunlight, because you lost the shadow effect, the anchoring of the soils from those biological legacies. The damage to the soils from logging just kills those seedlings. Or you plant them so dense that next time you get a fire, they're the kindling for the big fire events that we see. So there's a lot of problems with that. And, you know, I don't want to sound like I'm anti-tree planting, but, you know, it's like carbon offsets. It could play a role, but it's not going to save the day. We've got to look at atmospheric drawdown and storage of carbon by natural ecosystems as the top priority.
Dominic, do you think there's a chance that the federal government will use your data for its currently mandated inventory of old growth mature forests pursuant to Biden's executive order signed in April, or is it likely that they will try and reinvent the wheel and do their own analysis from the ground up?
I will know more about that tomorrow. My hope is that they will see this as, you know, having value in a collaborative process, because we're not the only ones that are doing this really cool mapping. You know, I get at least 3 or 4 papers a month to peer review that involve 30 by 30, that involve large landscape planning, connectivity mapping, climate refugia mapping. There's a lot of really important work out there. And I think it could be done quickly. And I just have to emphasize that while the federal government has a year to do this, it doesn't have to take a year. We want to kiss it. We want to keep it simple. We don't want this to just kind of drag out the process that we have left to get some strong policies enacted before January 2025. I mean, that's the time horizon that we need to be looking at, and what needs to be done to get to national rulemaking by January 2025. So it's on the president's desk and he signs it and we've got a new rule. We can't drag this process out. And if it takes a year to do inventory and definitions, the clock's going to run out. And so my hope is that, hey, here it is. Let's get this all together. Let's do it fast. And concurrently, let's get national rulemaking and a good faith gesture to pull those logging sales out that already are in these big tree forests. That needs to happen at the same time.
Okay, I know we've got more questions here in the chat, but we're coming up on 12:30 here. So I think we're gonna wrap up. I'm sorry to those of you who weren't able to have your questions answered. We're gonna take these questions, share them with Dominic, and try and get answers to all of these and send them out when we share the recording of this webinar. We'll also be including information about the comment period. I know, Dominic, you said the deadline was extended to August 30th. It does on the Federal Register still say that August 15th is the deadline. So keep an eye on that, and, you know, never too early to get comments in. Make sure you don't miss the deadline. But with that, I just want to thank Dominic so much for sharing all your knowledge today. Really amazing, really informative, as well as all of our co-sponsors, the Biodiversity Project, John Muir Project, Forest Carbon Coalition, Climate Forest Campaign, Standing Trees, and the Pacific Northwest Forest Climate Alliance. Again, that comment period, we'll be sending it out. The link is in the chat. Please, we're trying to get 100,000 comments in to really push the Biden administration strongly on this. So please submit comments. And then I think that's it. Paula, am I forgetting anything as we wrap up here that you want to include? Okay. Well, thank you again, Dominic, and thanks everyone for being here today.
Thanks, everybody.